Every morning, the quiet suburban streets began to wake up, but for the man and his dog, it was already time for their daily walk. They had a rhythm, a simple routine that neither of them ever missed. The man, a middle-aged figure in worn-out jeans and a jacket, moved with purpose, but his pace always slowed when his dog, an energetic German shepherd, tugged at the leash. The dog had been with him for years, a companion through both quiet moments and more intense ones, like those he experienced during his time in the military. Though he had long since left that life behind, the habits and instincts stayed with him. He never walked with his back to the street, always watching, always aware. It was second nature. His dog had been trained to be alert as well. Their walks had become a quiet time for reflection for him, and for his dog it was simply a time to explore and enjoy the freedom of the world around them. The man cherished these moments, where he could almost forget the weight of his past and live in the present, if only for a short while. That particular morning, however, something was different. The air felt heavier, the sunlight filtering through the trees in a way that seemed unfamiliar. The streets, usually peaceful, had an odd quiet to them. It wasn't the usual hum of morning activity, cars starting, neighbors leaving for work, kids heading to school. Today it felt as though the world was holding its breath. As they walked, a black sedan turned down their street. The man didn't think much of it. He had seen it before, passing by, maybe a neighbor or someone from a nearby block. But as it slowed to a stop in front of him, his instincts kicked in. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. The car rolled to a halt and the window rolled down. Two officers inside, in full uniform, looked out at him. The man didn't recognize them, and their gaze was intense, scanning him and his dog with purpose. The dog, who had been trotting happily beside him, immediately sensed the shift in the air. Its ears perked up, its body going tense. The man felt the change too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He gave a subtle tug on the leash, but the dog was already too far into alert mode. Without warning, it began to bark, loud and sharp, its body stiff and focused on the officers in the car. The officers seemed taken aback by the dog's reaction. One of them hesitated before speaking. "Is that your dog?" one officer asked, his voice rough, the kind that comes with authority. The man nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't sure why, but he could sense something was off. The officer's gaze flicked down to the dog, who was still growling, showing teeth in response to the tension in the air. "He's not usually like this," the man said, trying to keep his voice calm, though he could feel a knot tightening in his stomach. "He's just protective." The officer raised an eyebrow, his hand hovering near his gun holster, not making any sudden moves but clearly on edge. The other officer leaned back in his seat, watching both the man and his dog closely. "You mind stepping away from the car, sir?" the second officer called out. The man hesitated. His instincts were telling him to comply, to do what the officers asked, but there was something about the situation that didn't sit right. He took a step back, keeping his hand gently on the dog's leash, trying to calm it down. "I'm just out for a walk," the man explained, hoping his voice didn't betray the unease he felt. No harm meant, but the dog was having none of it. Its growls grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a warning now. It was clear that the dog felt threatened. The officer who had first spoken to him glanced over at his partner. A silent exchange passed between them, and then, without any further word, the first officer stepped out of the car. He reached for something on his belt. The man's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening, something that wasn't right. He tried to pull on the leash again, urging the dog to calm down. But the dog, sensing the officer's movement, lunged forward, barking furiously. It was in that instant that everything escalated. The officer, clearly startled by the sudden movement, drew his gun. The sound of the safety clicking off echoed in the still morning air. The man froze. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, but his body remained still. He had been trained to keep his cool in high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his neighborhood. His dog was in danger. The officer took a step back, eyes wide, but his hand remained firm on the gun. He wasn't sure what to do now. His partner hadn't moved, just watching, waiting. The man's mind raced, calculating the situation. His dog was close now, barking in fury, and the officer was clearly getting agitated. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but the growing sense of dread was overwhelming. Suddenly, the officer raised his gun. The man's world seemed to slow down in that moment. He knew what was coming next. He had seen it in the war. Split-second decisions that could alter the course of everything. The dog was still growling, still barking, trying to protect its owner from what it sensed was a threat. The officer pulled the trigger. It happened so quickly, the sound of the gunshot ringing in the man's ears. His heart lurched. The dog yelped, the sound sharp and filled with pain. The man's body moved before his mind could process it. He dropped to his knees beside his dog, hands trembling as he reached out for it. "No," he shouted, his voice desperate as he cradled his dog's head in his lap. The blood pooled beneath the dog's body, dark against the pavement. The dog's breathing slowed, its eyes glassy. It whined once, a soft, pained sound that broke the man's heart. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to happen. His dog was dead, and there was nothing he could do to bring it back. The officers stood there, silent now. One of them lowered his gun, the other still watching, unsure of what to do next. The man barely noticed. He was focused entirely on his dog, tears stinging his eyes as he whispered words of comfort, though he knew the dog wouldn't hear them. The moment stretched on, time bending in a way that felt cruel. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in his ears, and everything seemed to blur, the world turning into a gray fog. All the while, the officers remained frozen, unsure of how to proceed now that the situation had spiraled out of control. But the man wasn't thinking about them. His mind was elsewhere, back to the memories of his time in Delta Force when he had seen too much, lost too much. The man had always carried a heavy burden, but now the weight of the loss he felt was unbearable, and in that moment all he could think about was the bond he had shared with his dog. Everything else, the officers, the misunderstanding, the tragic mistake, felt distant. He had lost something more important than a pet. He had lost a piece of himself. The man sat motionless on the ground, his arms cradling his dog's lifeless body. His mind was blank, though his heart was anything but still. It was as if time itself had stopped, the morning air heavy with a silence that felt almost deafening. The only sound that broke the stillness was the faint, distant hum of a car passing by. Nothing else seemed to matter now. In those moments, memories of his life before this quiet suburban street flooded his mind. He had long since abandoned the life that made him who he was, the life where his every step was measured, every decision crucial. Back then, he was part of something much larger than himself, a soldier in an elite unit, trained to face dangers no one else could imagine. He had been trained to fight, to survive, and to protect. But this loss felt different. It cut deeper than any battlefield wound ever could. His dog had been more than just a companion. It was a reminder of a time when he was someone else entirely, a reminder of the courage he used to carry, the strength he had once relied on. But now those memories seemed distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. The man had left that world behind, wanting nothing more than peace. He wanted a simple life, but peace had slipped through his fingers just when he thought he could finally hold on to it. The dog had been his constant, a loyal companion through thick and thin. The bond they shared was forged over years of trust and understanding. The dog had been with him through some of his darkest moments. The dog's presence a quiet reassurance that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. No matter what had happened, his dog was always there, and now that presence was gone, taken away in an instant. He stood up slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't want to. The anger bubbling inside him was too much to contain, but he wasn't sure how to direct it. The officers, standing a few feet away, were still in shock. They had no idea who he really was. To them, he was just another resident of a quiet neighborhood, walking his dog on a regular morning. They didn't know the man standing before them had once been a part of something so secretive, so intense, that it made the routine of their daily lives seem insignificant by comparison. The man didn't care about their confusion or hesitation. His thoughts were too consumed with the weight of his grief. He had lived through too many harrowing experiences to let this go unnoticed. The officers had made a mistake, a costly one, and he wasn't sure he could let them off so easily. But at the same time, he knew that violence wouldn't bring back what he had lost. Still, something in him yearned for justice, something deeper than just the loss of his dog. One of the officers, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. We didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice shaky. "The dog came at us so fast, we didn't have time to think." The man didn't respond immediately. He was still holding his dog's lifeless body, his fingers pressing into the animal's fur as if trying to feel something, anything, that would remind him of the bond they had. He wanted to say something, anything that would make them understand, but words felt inadequate. How could he explain the depth of what he had lost? How could he make them understand that this wasn't just a dog? It was family. He could feel the anger rising again, this time mixing with something else, something colder, more calculated. He had learned to control his emotions during his time in the military, but that didn't mean the emotions weren't there. He was still human, after all. And right now he was a man with a broken heart, standing in the street with the lifeless body of his dog, facing two officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. "I'm sorry," one officer said again, his voice now more measured, as if he was trying to understand the gravity of what had happened. "But we had no choice. The dog was acting aggressively. We had to protect ourselves." The man finally looked up at them, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You had no choice?" he repeated softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You had no choice but to kill my dog?" The officer faltered, his face reddening as he stammered. I didn't mean to." The man held up his hand, silencing him. He had heard enough. "I don't care what you meant. You took something from me. You don't get to say you had no choice. You made a choice, and now I have to live with that." There was a long pause, and for a moment neither officer knew how to respond. The air between them was thick with the man's anger, but also with something else, something that neither of them could name. The man's presence was overwhelming, even if he wasn't saying much. There was a calmness about him, a stillness that made them both uneasy. They had no idea who this man truly was, but they could sense something dangerous in the way he carried himself. The officers exchanged a glance, both realizing that they had underestimated him. They hadn't known his background, but now they couldn't help but feel that they were dealing with someone far beyond the ordinary. His composure, his silence, it wasn't like the typical civilian response. There was a quiet intensity to him that they both found unsettling. "I need you to take the body," the man said suddenly, his voice flat, almost robotic. "You're going to do that for me, and then you're going to leave." The officers didn't know how to respond. They had expected the man to be angry, but this was different. There was something about him that made them pause. They could see the pain in his eyes, the deep sadness that could only come from a loss like this. But there was something else, something they couldn't quite grasp. They hesitated for a moment before one of the officers spoke again. We'll call animal control," he said, his voice uncertain. "We'll take care of it." The man nodded slowly, still not looking at them. "Good, just remember, you don't know me. You don't know who I am, so don't ever forget this." Without waiting for a response, the man turned and started walking away, leaving the officers standing there, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. The dog was still lying in the street, its body a stark reminder of the mistake they had made. As the man walked, his thoughts were consumed with memories of the years spent in Delta Force, of the missions that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had seen death before, up close and personal, but this was different. This wasn't the chaos of war. This wasn't a life and death decision in the heat of battle. This was a man trying to live peacefully, trying to leave behind the violence and bloodshed of his past. And yet here he was again, caught in a storm of anger, loss, and confusion. He had always been good at controlling his emotions, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just the loss of his dog. It was everything. The weight of his past, the scars he carried with him, all of it had come rushing back in that moment. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had once seemed simple, but now felt so much more complicated. The man walked back to his house, each step heavier than the last. His dog was gone, and the pain was so deep it felt like it was carving a hole inside him. He didn't know how to move forward, didn't know what to do next. The emptiness in his chest seemed to expand with every passing second, and as he stepped through the front door, it hit him even harder. He didn't need to look at the empty dog bed by the door to feel the void. It was there in the stillness of the house. The quiet was oppressive, a constant reminder that his companion, his protector, was no longer there. The house felt colder now, the walls too close, the air too thin. The man let out a long sigh as he dropped his keys onto the table, his fingers lingering for a moment before he turned and walked into the kitchen. He had always prided himself on his ability to adapt, to move on from the things that weighed him down. But this was different. His dog had been more than just a pet. It had been a lifeline, a connection to something real when everything else in his life felt like it was falling apart. And now that connection was gone. As the man sat down at the kitchen table, his hands gripped the edge, his knuckles white. His mind kept flashing back to the moments before the gunshot, the way his dog had reacted to the officers, the way it had tried to protect him. The thought of it made his heart ache. The dog had only been trying to do what it was trained to do, protect him. And yet it had paid the price with its life. The anger that had been simmering inside him began to bubble to the surface once again. He had spent years training, honing his skills in a world where every decision counted, where the stakes were high. In that world, people didn't make mistakes. They couldn't afford to. And yet here he was, a man who had survived some of the most dangerous situations, feeling powerless in the face of this simple injustice. He had been left helpless in the most personal of circumstances, his hands clenched into fists as the anger began to consume him. He didn't know what to do with it. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had been part of an elite force, trained to deal with the unimaginable, but this was different. The rules weren't the same anymore. The world outside the military was complicated, messy. People made mistakes, and sometimes they couldn't undo what they had done. The man took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to calm himself, but the images kept coming. His dog's final moments, the officers standing there clueless about who he really was, the fear in their eyes. They didn't know him. They didn't know the man they had just crossed. He had always kept his past hidden from everyone, living a life of quiet anonymity, but now that past felt like it was creeping back into his present. He could feel the tension rising in him, the old habits starting to resurface, the need for control, the need for justice. The man pushed his chair back from the table, standing up abruptly. His movements were sharp, almost mechanical. He didn't want to feel this way. He didn't want to let this consume him, but the loss was too much. It was too much to bear alone. Outside, the street was still quiet, just like it always had been. The sounds of the neighborhood filtered in through the window, the distant hum of a lawnmower, a car driving by. But everything felt different now. The silence in the house had matched the stillness outside. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to make a decision. The man paced around the room, his thoughts swirling. He kept coming back to the officers, to their misunderstanding, to the way they had reacted. They had been scared, he knew that. They had seen the dog as a threat, and in the heat of the moment they had acted. But they hadn't known who he was. They hadn't known the kind of man they were dealing with. If they had known, would they have acted differently? Would they have still made the same decision? He didn't know. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that they needed to understand the consequences of their actions. The man grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and slipped it on, his fingers working quickly as he prepared to leave the house. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just let this go. Not after everything. Not after what had been taken from him. He stepped out the door and into the street, his boots making a dull thud on the pavement as he walked. The sun was still rising, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. But the warmth of the sunlight couldn't chase away the cold feeling that had settled inside him. He needed answers. He needed to know that the officers understood what they had done. As he walked, his mind flashed back to his time in Delta Force, to the missions he had completed, to the countless lives he had touched, some saved, others lost. The weight of it all had been heavy, but it had never felt like this. Back then his decisions had been life or death, but there had always been a purpose, a reason. Now he was left with nothing but this empty, painful grief. His dog had been his purpose here, his constant, and now it was gone. The man stopped in front of the police station, his gaze fixed on the building ahead. It was a small, nondescript structure, the kind of place where routine paperwork was filed, where officers went about their day-to-day tasks. But to the man it represented something much more. It was a symbol of the injustice he felt, a reminder of the system that had failed him. He had spent years working within systems, following orders, but this was personal. His fingers brushed against the door handle, the cold metal sending a chill up his arm. He hesitated for a moment, his thoughts racing. What was he really hoping to accomplish here? Would confronting the officers change anything? Would it make him feel better? Would it bring his dog back? The door opened with a soft creak and he stepped inside. The quiet hum of the station was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. A young officer behind the desk looked up as he entered, his eyes flicking over the man's face before glancing down at the papers in front of him. The man walked up to the counter, his presence filling the small space. "I need to speak with the officers who were involved in the shooting," the man said, his voice steady, but there was a hard edge to it that made the officer pause. The young officer looked at him for a moment, uncertain before nodding. "I'll need to check with Sergeant Mitchell." "Just a moment." The man nodded, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He wasn't here for a conversation. He wasn't here for apologies. He was here for one thing and one thing only: accountability. The man didn't care about their excuses. He didn't care about their fear. They had taken something from him, and now they needed to understand the consequences of their actions. As the officer disappeared down the hallway, the man stood in silence, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past, of what had led him to this point. He had tried to leave it all behind, the violence, the bloodshed, but it seemed that it wasn't so easily forgotten. It followed him, just as the grief from losing his dog would follow him, forever changing his life. When the officer returned with Sergeant Mitchell, the man didn't wait for introductions. He was ready. He had made his decision. "I need to know why," the man said, his voice quiet but forceful. "Why did it have to end like this?" Sergeant Mitchell studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. But the man could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They didn't know who he was, and that, in a way, gave him the upper hand. The air in the police station felt dense, charged with an unspoken tension, as the man stood across from Sergeant Mitchell. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound filling the silence. The young officer had retreated into the back, leaving just the man and the sergeant in the small, sterile room. The man could feel the weight of the situation, and he could see it reflected in the sergeant's face, a mixture of concern, uncertainty, and something else. Maybe guilt. Sergeant Mitchell had just asked him to sit, but the man remained standing, his arms folded across his chest, his jaw clenched. He wasn't here to have a calm conversation. He wasn't here to be polite. He was here because what had happened to his dog couldn't be left unaddressed. "You asked why?" Sergeant Mitchell finally spoke, his voice steady but not without the edge of discomfort. "I wish I could say there was an easy answer to that. But there isn't." The man didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the sergeant, waiting for him to continue. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but he was careful to keep it under control. This wasn't a moment for rash decisions. He had learned that lesson long ago. "It was an unfortunate situation," Mitchell continued, his gaze flicking nervously to the door as if looking for an escape. "Your dog? It wasn't just barking. It was charging at us. We were forced to make a decision." The man's eyes narrowed. He could hear the words, but they didn't make sense. He had lived through chaos, through dangerous situations where decisions had to be made in the blink of an eye. He knew what it meant to make tough calls in high-pressure situations. But this wasn't a war zone. This wasn't a place where split-second decisions should result in death. This was his home, his dog, and the whole thing felt wrong. "You shot my dog," the man said slowly, each word carrying the weight of his grief. "My dog was trying to protect me. It wasn't charging at you. It was doing what it was trained to do." Sergeant Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to speak, but the man wasn't finished. "I've been in situations where lives are on the line, where everything moves in fast forward," he said, his voice low but steady. "I understand fear. I understand instinct. But I also understand responsibility. You weren't in a situation where you were fighting for your life. You were scared and you made a mistake. My dog paid for that mistake." Mitchell looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the man's words. "I'm not denying that," he admitted. "We made a decision in the moment. We believed we were under threat." The man's eyes hardened. He had heard enough of this. The excuses, the uncertainty, the reluctance to take full responsibility. It was all adding up to one conclusion. They didn't understand the gravity of what they had done. "No," the man said, his voice quieter now, but still carrying that edge of authority. "You didn't believe you were under threat. You reacted out of fear. You didn't think. And now I'm standing here asking you to take responsibility for it." The sergeant swallowed, his discomfort growing. He seemed to realize the man wasn't going to let this go easily. The man had already seen enough. Mitchell's body language said it all. The man didn't want to be here. He didn't want to face the reality of what had happened, but the man wasn't going to let him off the hook. Who else was there? The man asked, his tone still firm. Who else was involved in the decision to shoot? Mitchell hesitated, then sighed. Officer Garcia was the one who fired. It was his call. I didn't expect him to do it, but I couldn't stop him in time. So Garcia is the one who made the final call? The man pressed. Yes, Mitchell answered, looking him in the eye now. I was there and I could have intervened. I should have, but it happened so fast. He paused, taking a breath before continuing. Look, I know it doesn't make it right, but the situation spiraled out of control and I don't know what else to say. The man's chest tightened. The reality of it all was sinking in. This wasn't a simple mistake. Not in the way Mitchell was trying to paint it. This was an irreversible act, one that couldn't be undone with apologies. The man had trained for years in environments where lives were on the line. He knew the value of precision, of knowing when to act and when to hold back, but none of that training had prepared him for something like this, losing his dog to a thoughtless mistake. You don't have to say anything, the man replied, his voice suddenly cold. But understand this isn't just about a dog. This is about accountability. If you don't understand that now, I'm not sure you ever will. Mitchell looked as though he might argue, but the man wasn't giving him the chance. I don't want your pity, and I don't want your empty apologies. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You didn't just shoot a dog. You took something from me, something that can never be replaced. For a moment, there was a silence between them. Sergeant Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The man could see the wheels turning in his head, but nothing could change what had happened. I know what it's like to live with consequences, the man said, his voice softer now. I've lived through them every day of my life. But you haven't, and I don't think you ever will unless you take responsibility for what you did. Mitchell looked at him, the weight of the words hitting him hard. It was clear now, the man was right. This wasn't just about the dog. It was about a lapse in judgment, about a moment when fear overcame the responsibility that should have guided their actions. And now the sergeant had to face it. He had to reckon with the reality of what had happened and understand that there were consequences beyond just apologizing. I'll speak to Garcia, Mitchell said finally, his voice quieter than before. I'll make sure he understands the severity of the situation. And I'll do everything I can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. The man nodded, the hard edge in his expression softening just slightly. That's all I'm asking. You can't undo what's been done, but you can make sure it doesn't happen again. The sergeant seemed to accept that, and for the first time in their conversation, there was a sense of resolution. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to bring his dog back, but it was a start. At least Mitchell seemed to understand that accountability mattered. As the man turned to leave, he stopped by the door. Without looking back, he spoke one final time. I don't care about what you say to Garcia. What matters is that you learned something today. That's the only reason I came here, and I hope it sticks with you. With that, he stepped out of the station and into the cold, early evening air. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it was a beginning. And for the first time since everything had happened, the man felt a small flicker of something. Maybe hope, or maybe just the smallest taste of justice. Either way, it was something he could hold on to, even if only for a moment. The days that followed were not easy for the man. He found himself waking up to an empty house, the silence heavier now, and every little sound seemed to remind him of what was lost. The mornings were the hardest, when he would automatically reach for the leash to take his dog out, only to remember that the one who had walked beside him for so long was never coming back. His routines, once so comforting, felt hollow without the presence of his loyal companion. Still, life outside the house moved on. Neighbors came and went. The world around him continued, but for the man, the world had stopped when his dog had died. Each step forward felt like an immense weight on his shoulders. It wasn't that he didn't understand that life had to move forward. It was just that in his heart he didn't know how to keep going without the presence of his dog. He had been through so much before, faced so many dangers, but this was different. This was personal. This wasn't just about the pain of losing a friend. It was about the feeling of betrayal and injustice that lingered long after the grief. He had thought that confronting the officers, speaking his mind, might bring him some relief. But as the days wore on, he realized it wasn't enough. He had to do something more. Something that would make sure this didn't just fade away into the background like so many other injustices in the world. The man knew that justice wouldn't bring his dog back. But he had learned in his years of service that justice wasn't always about bringing back what was lost. It was about ensuring that mistakes didn't happen again. That's why after he left the police station, he made a decision. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but it was one that felt necessary. He began his search, reaching out to people in the community, quietly gathering information about the officers involved. The more he learned, the more he realized that the officers who had acted so recklessly that day didn't fully understand the consequences of their actions. They didn't understand what it meant to take something so valuable from someone, to be the cause of such a profound loss. The man wasn't interested in revenge. That wasn't his way. But accountability? That was something he could fight for. And so he began to talk to anyone who would listen. Lawyers, local activists, even some of the officers' colleagues. He wasn't trying to turn it into something bigger than it needed to be, but he wasn't going to let it disappear either. He wanted the truth to be heard. He wanted those responsible to feel the weight of what they had done. The meetings were exhausting, emotionally draining. It seemed as though every time he spoke to someone, he had to relive the pain of losing his dog, the frustration of having to explain it over and over again. But despite the emotional toll, he pushed forward. Every conversation, every meeting, felt like a small step toward the closure he so desperately needed. There were moments when the weight of it all became too much. Late at night, when the house was too quiet, the man would feel the familiar knot in his stomach, the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, nothing was ever going to be enough. But then he would remember the words he had spoken to Sergeant Mitchell. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them pay in the way he wished they would. It was about making sure they understood that their actions had consequences. He couldn't let them get away with pretending like nothing had happened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool air began to settle in, the man sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. His mind wandered back to the days when he had lived a life of purpose, of missions and orders, of moments where every decision mattered. He had once believed that there was always a right and a wrong, that there was a clear path to follow. But life after the military had been more complicated than he had anticipated. There were no orders to follow, no clear-cut right or wrong, just a constant weighing of choices and consequences. He thought about the officers again. He thought about Garcia, the one who had fired the shot. And he wondered if Garcia would ever truly understand what had happened, if he would ever feel the same grief, the same emptiness that the man felt. It was hard to believe he ever would. How could someone who had never known what it was like to lose a loyal companion, someone who had never faced the kind of loss the man had, ever truly understand? As the days passed, the man kept his focus. He continued to push for answers, to hold the officers accountable. He made phone calls, sent letters, and showed up at town hall meetings. Slowly but surely, he began to see small signs that things were changing. The department had started reviewing its policies on how to handle situations involving aggressive animals. Officers were being trained more thoroughly in how to assess danger in everyday situations. There was no guarantee that it would prevent something like this from happening again. But it was a start, and that was all the man could ask for. But even as the changes were being made, the man knew that the pain of losing his dog would never fully go away. The bond they had shared was unique, unspoken, and irreplaceable. And in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss, he found himself wondering if there would ever be a day when the memory of his dog didn't bring a pang of sorrow. It wasn't just about the dog, though. It was about the principle. It was about making sure that the officers who had acted out of fear, without considering the larger picture, understood that they were accountable for their actions, that they couldn't just walk away from the pain they had caused. The man had learned through years of service and hardship that responsibility wasn't just about doing the right thing in the moment. It was about owning up to the mistakes you made and taking steps to make things right. As he sat there on the porch, he thought about the journey he had been on since that fateful day. It had been a hard, painful road, full of moments of doubt and frustration. But it had also been a journey toward something important. He had fought for accountability, not just for himself, but for others who might one day face similar situations. He had stood up for the principle that no one should ever be allowed to take something so precious from someone else without facing the consequences. And in the end, that was enough. It would have to be enough. He stood up from the porch, the weight of the day settling in his bones. As he stepped back inside, he glanced at the dog's bed one last time, the memory of his loyal companion still fresh in his mind. The pain was still there, but it was different now. He had done everything he could. He had faced the injustice head-on and fought for something that mattered. The road ahead wasn't easy. It never would be. But as he lay down to sleep that night, he knew that he had done the right thing. He had stood for what was important, even when the world seemed to want to move on without him. And that, in the end, was a victory.